You don't wake up on your 68th birthday expecting betrayal. You wake up with hope, quiet, cautious, but real. You smooth your hair, light the vanilla candle on the windowsill, and hum a little song you don't realize you're still singing from years ago. You cook a pot roast even though it's just you. You set the table for two, even though the other chair's been empty for a while now. And when the phone doesn't ring by 10, you don't panic. You just tell yourself maybe he's busy, maybe there's a surprise, maybe there's grace waiting just around the corner. But let me tell you something no one prepares you for. Sometimes the people you give your entire life to will erase you while smiling, and they'll call it help. They'll call it love. They'll call it safety. But it won't feel like any of those things. And this is where my story starts. The thing about living alone for a long time is that you get very good at small rituals. I always liked tidy mornings. I'd wake early, pull on my navy robe, open the windows just wide enough to let in the foggy California air, and make a slow pot of coffee. French press, never instant. I had time now. I had my peace. My name is Margot Feldman. I taught high school English for 36 years in Santa Rosa, California. Never married, raised my son Todd on my own. He used to leave sticky notes in my lesson planner when he was little. Have a good class, Mom. Don't forget lunch. Once he scribbled, "You're my favorite person in the whole world," and I carried that one in my wallet until it faded. I gave that boy everything, not in the grand, flashy sense. No private schools or ski trips, just the kind of everything that costs you your back, your breath, your dreams of something easier. When he got into Stanford, I sold my parents' land in Oregon without blinking. That land had been in our family 3 generations. But I told myself, this is how legacies work. You pass the torch. You lift your child higher than you ever reached. Isn't that what good mothers do? So this year, when my 68th birthday landed on a Tuesday, I didn't expect a party, but I hoped for a visit. A call, something. I put a pot roast in the slow cooker around 8 a.m., his favorite. I even made that onion gravy from scratch, the one he used to beg for in high school. I pulled out the nice plates, set the table for 2, wore the lavender blouse he once said made me look like royalty. It had pearl buttons I re-sewed myself last fall after one popped off in the dryer. By 10, there was no call. I didn't worry yet. By noon, still nothing. I paced a bit, checked the door, the porch, the mailbox. Like maybe I'd missed something. Maybe there was a note, a card, something. But the house was quiet except for the bubbling pot roast and the soft hum of the kitchen fan. By 2 o'clock, I was starting to feel a little silly. I sat on the couch holding my mug of tea, watching the sunlight shift through the blinds. I told myself, he's probably on his way. I even laughed out loud once. Too loud, really, just to break the silence. Then at 2:17 p.m., the doorbell rang. I remember the exact time because my heart jumped like it hadn't in years. I practically ran to the door, and there he was. Todd, my Todd, tall, polished, wearing that pressed gray jacket he always wore when he was handling business. He smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. In his hand was a bouquet of grocery store flowers, carnations mostly. A few were already browning at the edges. "Happy birthday, Mom," he said, voice too bright, too clipped. I smiled and hugged him, ignoring the little pinch in my chest. "You came," I whispered into his shoulder. "Of course," he replied, patting my back like I was an acquaintance. Then he pulled away. "Get dressed. I made lunch reservations." "Where?" I asked. "You'll see." I didn't question it. I grabbed my shoes, the beige flats that pinch a little, and followed him out to the car. It felt like a movie moment. My son, remembering me, taking me out. Maybe I doubted too soon. We didn't drive toward downtown, not toward the little French bistro he knew I liked. We passed it. We passed everything familiar. "Where are we going?" I asked, watching the trees blur by. "You'll see," he repeated, not looking at me. The road began to curve. We entered a quiet, wooded area lined with crisp ash trees. I saw the sign before he said anything. Hollow Pines Memory and Wellness Center. My stomach dropped. "Todd?" I said softly. He didn't respond, just pulled into the lot and parked. I didn't move. My hands clenched the strap of my purse. "What is this?" He exhaled sharply, like this was hard for him. "Mom, we need to talk." No one ever says we need to talk when good things are coming. "I found a place. It's safe, beautiful. You'll have people your age. Activities? No more stress about living alone." My mouth went dry. "Todd, I don't need this." He reached into the back seat and pulled out a small suitcase. My suitcase. Packed. "You went through my house?" "It's for your own good." He opened his briefcase and handed a folder to the receptionist. I caught a glimpse before it disappeared behind the desk. Durable power of attorney signed. My name. His signature. A date I didn't remember. It hit me then, like cold air through a cracked window. He'd already decided, not just today. Long before this, I was already gone in his mind. I walked into that place like I was watching someone else's life. They gave me a room with beige walls and a twin bed, a window that looked out onto a brick wall. That night, I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at nothing. I wasn't crying. I wasn't angry. I was erased. And in that silence, something shifted. Something deep. I remembered the land I sold, the notes in my planner, the pot roast cooling on the counter of a house I wasn't allowed to return to. And all I could think was, this isn't how my story ends. No. This was just the beginning of a revenge story I didn't even know I was capable of telling. The second night in Hollow Pines was colder than the first. I hadn't touched the dinner tray they brought, some kind of gray chicken and peas that tasted like paper. I just stared out the window at the same brick wall and thought about how fast a life can be reduced to square footage and a clipboard. There's a sharp kind of betrayal when it comes from your own child. It doesn't scream, it doesn't slap, it just means. It signs papers you never saw. It smiles while telling strangers what's best for you. It builds your prison with polite language and care packages. And when it's all said and done, you're the one who looks crazy if you fight back. The next morning, I was escorted to the main lounge where a woman in beige called roll. Not names, room numbers. I was now room 27. I remember sitting in that stiff armchair, surrounded by quiet shuffling and the dull tap of walkers on linoleum, thinking, is this really it? At some point that afternoon, the facility administrator, Ms. Brenner, called me into her office. She had one of those soothing voices that made everything sound like an apology and a warning at the same time. "We're glad to have you with us, Margot," she said. "Todd mentioned you'd been forgetting things." "I haven't," I replied, calm but firm. She tilted her head. "He said you once left the stove on overnight." That was 10 years ago, and it was a toaster oven. Her smile didn't move. "Still, families worry. Todd's been very involved. He's concerned for your safety." I leaned forward. "Ms. Brenner, I taught hundreds of kids. I drove myself to work every day until retirement. I do my taxes. I remember birthdays. I am not confused. I am not unstable. I am not a ward." She folded her hands as if I'd just confirmed her diagnosis. "You have a room here, and legally, your son has full authority." I left that office with my hands shaking. That night, I asked to call my friend Doris. They said the phones were out for maintenance. I asked again the next day. This time, they said Doris wasn't on the approved contact list from my son. It hit me then. I wasn't just here. I was contained, controlled. Every move I made filtered through the man I raised. And what stung the most? I hadn't been yelling. I hadn't cursed. I hadn't done anything to deserve this, except grow old. You know, I wonder if you're watching this and you're a mother, a grandmother, have you ever had a moment where the very people you sacrificed everything for looked at you like a burden instead of a blessing? If you've been through that, even just once, I want you to leave a comment. Tell me, was there a moment when you realized your love was being translated as weakness? You're not alone. The day after that, Todd visited. I almost didn't recognize him at first. He looked relieved, like someone who just crossed a tough item off his to-do list. He brought me lemon cookies from the store near my old house, my favorite, a sweet little insult tied with a ribbon. He sat down across from me in the lounge and said, "So, how are we adjusting?" "We?" I said, eyebrows raised. "Am I sharing this experience with you?" He gave a thin smile. I meant, how are you adjusting? I stared at him for a long second before answering, like a teacher whose best student just forged her signature and locked her in a closet. He chuckled. You always had a flair for drama, Mom. No, I said quietly. I had a flair for hope. That's dead now, he sighed. You were living alone. It wasn't safe. I was just trying to do what's best. What was best for who? I asked. You, with the mortgage on the new condo, the loan you took out last year using my account as collateral? His eyes flickered. You think I didn't see the transfer? $17,200 from my savings on January 12th. You think I didn't notice when my bank statement stopped arriving? You're confused, he said too quickly. No, I was compliant. There's a difference. He stood up then, grabbing his coat. Look, this is temporary. You'll get used to it. You'll even like it here. Like a frog in warm water, I said, right before it boils. He paused at the door. I'll come by next week. Let me know if you need anything. I wanted to scream, but I didn't. I didn't throw the cookies or cry or beg. I just nodded. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay in the narrow bed and stared at the ceiling, thinking of all the tiny decisions that led here, the sacrifices, the blind spots, the belief that love was enough. I remembered the Oregon land, the notes in my wallet, the summer I took on night shifts so Todd could go to soccer camp, the way he used to say, "You're the smartest woman I know, Mom." And now I was someone whose memory he claimed was broken, whose will he tried to override, whose story he thought he could erase. That was when I knew something had shifted in me forever. It wasn't anger that settled in my chest that night. It was clarity. They say betrayal teaches you who people are, but sometimes it also teaches you who you are, underneath all the giving, the forgiving, the waiting. I wasn't going to wait anymore. This wouldn't be a dramatic showdown or a screaming match in court. No, my path would be quieter, deeper, more deliberate. I was going to remember who I was, and I was going to make damn sure he never forgot it again. 3 weeks in, and I still hadn't cried. Not when they took my phone, not when they said I had to get approval before sending letters. Not even when the night nurse called me sweetheart in that condescending voice that made me feel 100 years old. But there was a different kind of ache settling in, a quiet, suffocating kind. The kind that wraps itself around your chest, not because of what you've lost, but because of how invisible your life has become. I wasn't Margot Feldman, English teacher, mother, human being. I was just another file in a locked cabinet. Another woman too old to fight, too polite to make noise. No one at Hollow Pines knew that I once held after-school poetry clubs, that I stayed up with my son until 2 a.m., teaching him how to write college essays, that I had a laugh loud enough to turn heads in restaurants. I was background now. Beige, like the walls. They gave me a roommate after 10 days. Her name was Ellen, 86, mostly nonverbal except for sudden bursts of hymns she sang late at night. I didn't mind. There was something oddly comforting about hearing "Jesus Loves Me" hummed in the dark. At least someone was still singing. On the 12th night, she died in her sleep. It was gentle, they said. Peaceful. She didn't have family, just a nephew in New Mexico they couldn't reach. They cleared her things before lunch. The bed was made by noon. By dinner, someone else had already moved in. They almost tossed everything, her cardigan, the old rosary, and a worn-out leather Bible tucked into her drawer. I asked the nurse if I could keep the Bible just for the memory. She shrugged. Sure, better than the trash. I opened it later that night, just to find a name or a note. Instead, something slid out from the pages of Psalms, a lottery ticket. I blinked, held it up to the light. It wasn't old. A recent date, just 4 days before Ellen passed, numbers carefully marked. My heart did a little skip. Probably nothing, I thought. But still, something about the neatness of it felt intentional. The next morning, during our wellness walk around the fenced courtyard, I spotted a young nurse named Allie. She'd always been a little different, quieter, softer around the edges. She once slipped me a chocolate when no one was looking. I called her over, holding the Bible open. Mind checking something for me? She looked at the numbers. This is recent. I know. Humor me. She glanced over her shoulder, then pulled out her phone. A few seconds later, her eyes widened. "Margot," she whispered, this is a match." I laughed. Not because I didn't believe her, but because it was so ridiculous I couldn't process it. 13.8 million, she added, barely breathing the words. I sat down hard on the nearest bench. It should have felt like joy, like rescue. But what I felt instead was fear, because I wasn't free, because Todd still had legal control over my life, because if he found out I had a winning lottery ticket, he wouldn't celebrate. He'd find a way to steal it too. I looked up at Allie. "We didn't have this conversation." She nodded, quietly sliding the ticket back into the Bible. "You have to be careful." "I've been careful my whole life," I said. "That's how I ended up here." That night, I didn't sleep. I lay in bed clutching that ticket like it was oxygen. My fingers kept brushing the paper just to make sure it was still real. And all I could think about was how ironic it was. I had money now, but not freedom. Not a soul in the world even knew I existed unless they got paid to remember. That was the night something cracked open in me. Not a scream, not a plan, not yet, but a deep shaking truth. I had no one, and no one was coming. Todd had made sure of that. He'd framed my independence as mental decline, my privacy as instability. He'd taken my signature, my house, my name, piece by piece, with the same steady calm he used to build Legos as a child. That was the part that haunted me most. He didn't hate me. He didn't even feel much of anything. I had become a financial inconvenience, a soft obstacle to be managed. I wasn't his mother anymore. I was an asset he'd locked in storage. The next morning, I asked Allie if she knew anyone who could help. "Legally?" she asked. "Yes, quietly." She hesitated, then said, "My cousin's a lawyer. He handles elder rights cases." "I don't want to sue anyone," I said. "Not yet. I just want to protect what's mine and get out before it's too late." She nodded. "I'll make the call." While we waited, I hid the ticket inside a tampon box in the bottom drawer of my nightstand, a place no one, not even the most invasive orderly, would touch. Every night before bed, I checked it, just to peek, just to remind myself I wasn't crazy, that I still had a card left to play. The days blurred, bingo in the mornings, lukewarm soup for lunch, a therapy session with a man who asked me if I remembered where I was, as if I hadn't been writing lesson plans when he was still in diapers. And still, I smiled. Still, I nodded, because now I had a secret. For the first time in weeks, I had something he couldn't take. Not yet. He thought he'd buried me in a system, but he forgot something. I spent my life teaching people how to read between the lines, and now it was time to write a different ending. There's something strange that happens when the fog in your life starts to lift. Not all at once, but slowly in pieces. It doesn't feel like clarity at first. It feels like betrayal again. Because when you finally see things clearly, you also see how long you let yourself be blind. It was raining the day Allie's cousin Daniel came to visit me. He wore a light gray suit and had the soft voice of someone used to explaining complicated things to people who've been burned before. He introduced himself quietly and asked if we could speak in the garden during visiting hours. Hollow Pines allowed it, as long as staff accompanied us. But Allie had already worked it out. She pretended to take me to a family meeting and gave us 15 minutes alone under a leaky gazebo behind the dining wing. The rain tapped gently on the tin roof above us like a warning clock. Daniel slid a manila envelope toward me and said, "I've reviewed the POA paperwork your son submitted. There's something off." I said nothing. I just watched the drops slide down the rim of the table. "There's a notary stamp here," he continued, "but it's expired. It had already lapsed 3 weeks before this was signed." I looked up slowly. "What does that mean?" "It means if this goes to court," Daniel said carefully, "there's a real chance we can have the POA invalidated, especially if we show there was financial motive, coercion, or misrepresentation involved." I stared at him. "That's a lot of ifs." "It is," he admitted, "but it's not impossible. and you've got something your son doesn't know you have." I raised an eyebrow. "Time," he said, and that's when it clicked. It wasn't just about the lottery ticket. It wasn't even about the money. It was about something I hadn't had in years: leverage. I spent the next week watching people more closely, watching how the nurses rotated schedules, how the phone was unlocked during certain hours, how visitors were logged. I became a student again, except this time the subject was survival. And maybe this sounds odd, but I also began to forgive myself. For the first time since all this began, I looked at myself not as a fool, but as someone who loved too long, too hard, and expected that would be enough. It wasn't. And that wasn't my failure. That was his. I realized that I had given Todd not just money, not just a home, not just years of my health. I had given him the benefit of the doubt over and over, even when he stopped giving me the benefit of humanity. And that's when I stopped grieving. I wasn't grieving my life anymore. I was remembering it. I remembered being 28 and carrying him up 3 flights of stairs in the rain because the elevator had broken. I remembered staying up all night when he had pneumonia. I remembered missing my own father's funeral because Todd was in the middle of SAT prep. And suddenly, those memories weren't painful anymore. They were proof. Proof I mattered. Proof I gave. Proof that what he tried to erase still existed. A few days later, during recreational therapy, which is what they called making old people glue macaroni on paper, I asked Allie if she could mail something for me. I handed her a plain white envelope. Inside, a copy of the lottery ticket, a handwritten letter to a bank I used to work with in Santa Rosa, and the contact info Daniel had given me. Allie nodded and didn't ask questions. From that point forward, I said nothing. I didn't change how I dressed. I didn't pace. I didn't confront Todd, even when he visited the following week and told me, "You're finally adjusting." I just smiled and said, "You were right. I needed rest." He patted my hand like I was a child and left without ever asking about my accounts, my thoughts, my spirit. And that was his mistake. He thought silence meant surrender. But I was no longer a woman waiting for permission. I was a woman counting down the days. You want to know something else I realized? Being forgotten hurts. But being misjudged, that's where the real fire comes from. He thought I'd lost my edge. He thought I'd been institutionalized, neutralized, softened into a version of myself that couldn't push back. But inside me, I felt the old Margot rising. The teacher who took no excuses, the single mom who fought with utility companies when bills came wrong, the woman who could carry a mortgage, a child, and a job with no safety net. I was still in here, and now I had something to fight for that wasn't just dignity. It was justice. That night, I wrote in the back of Ellen's Bible, just one line. He tried to bury me, but didn't know I was a seed, and for the first time in weeks, I slept through the night. Not because I felt safe, but because I felt ready. A strange thing happens when you stop needing permission to be angry. You start building instead. I didn't storm out of hollow pines. I didn't scream or demand my keys back or curse Todd's name in the hallway. What I did instead was wait. I waited for the bank to confirm receipt of the notarized letter I mailed through Allie. I waited for Daniel to call with news about the invalid POA. I waited, not like someone trapped, but like someone planting something in frozen ground. Quiet, patient, certain spring would come. And while I waited, I began to take myself back. One morning, I asked for my old reading glasses, the black-rimmed ones I loved, but Todd had replaced with lighter frames because he said they made me look less tired. Staff looked confused. "Don't you like your current pair?" one nurse asked. "No," I said with a small smile. "I like the ones that look like mine." They found them buried in a drawer in my original suitcase. When I put them on, it felt like seeing the world through my own eyes again, not filtered through what someone else thought was best for me. I started requesting old books, the real ones, not the oversized large print Reader's Digest copies they assumed women my age preferred. I wanted Steinbeck, Morrison, Baldwin. I asked for East of Eden, and when they finally brought it, I sat in the courtyard for an hour, holding it like a friend who'd been waiting all along. There was power in that. Not loud power, not angry power, but the kind that hums under your skin and makes you sit straighter. One of the aides walked past and said, "That's a big book." I looked up and said, "So is my life." Daniel called the next week. He said the court had reviewed the POA paperwork. The judge had flagged inconsistencies, not just the notary issue, but also the lack of medical evaluations tied to my alleged incapacity. He said there was a strong possibility of overturning it. "We're not there yet," he cautioned, "but we're moving." I thanked him. And then, for a while, I just sat quietly in my room, letting that sentence settle into my bones. We're moving. I whispered it like a prayer, because for the first time in months, maybe years, I wasn't just surviving. I was advancing. The ticket hadn't been claimed yet. Allie kept it in a safe place while the paperwork moved forward. I didn't check on it every day anymore. I didn't need to, because the money, as big as it was, wasn't what saved me. What saved me was remembering that I had never been helpless. I had just been taught, by years of giving, of sacrificing, of shrinking myself to fit others' comfort, that power wasn't mine to hold. Todd didn't invent that lie. He just took advantage of the fact that I believed it. By the end of the month, I'd stopped attending mandatory group engagement. I politely declined, explaining I was starting my own routine. I asked for 45 minutes of morning quiet in the garden. I requested an old CD player and played Nina Simone on low volume. I wrote in a notebook, just a few lines a day, thoughts about my life, what I'd given, what I'd learned. It wasn't for anyone but me. And slowly, I could feel it, the return of something I thought had vanished, my voice. Not the kind you use to fight in court, the kind that lets you look in the mirror and say, "I was never the problem." One afternoon, I ran into Todd in the hallway. He hadn't expected to see me there. I could tell by the way he blinked twice, like trying to refocus his eyes. "Mom," he said, cautious. "I didn't know you had therapy on Thursdays." "I don't," I said. "I had lunch with Daniel." He hesitated. "Daniel?" "My lawyer." His face went pale for half a second. "You didn't tell me you hired a lawyer." "I didn't tell you a lot of things," I said, calm. "That doesn't mean they didn't happen." He laughed nervously. "You're being dramatic again." "No," I said, lifting my chin slightly. "I'm being awake." And then I walked past him, slow and steady, like someone leaving a fire that could no longer touch her. He didn't follow. That night, I wrote in my notebook, "I used to think silence made me noble, but now I know. It made me invisible." And I underlined it twice. When the paperwork finally cleared, and the temporary injunction to suspend Todd's legal authority, I didn't throw a party. I made tea. I called Doris, my old friend from the book club, for the first time in months. We talked about everything and nothing. I told her I was doing all right, and she said she'd been praying for me. "I'm glad you didn't disappear," she whispered. I smiled. "Me too. Gee, I didn't pack that night. I didn't rush out of Hollow Pines. I stayed another week. Not because I had to, but because I wanted to leave slowly, on my terms. Because reclaiming your life isn't a door slam. It's the slow, steady turning of a knob you were told was locked. By the time I did leave, the staff lined up at the door. They shook my hand. They smiled differently, not out of pity, but something close to respect. Even Ms. Brenner said, "You're one of the sharpest we've had. I'm sorry we didn't see that sooner." I didn't answer. Because some things don't need a reply. They just need distance. I left Hollow Pines on a Tuesday morning. No balloons, no car waiting. Just Allie walking me to the sidewalk with a thermos of tea and a hug that lasted a second longer than expected. She didn't say much, just, "You did it." I nodded. She tucked the envelope with the official release papers into my tote and whispered, "Keep rising, Miss Feldman." I didn't go back to my house. Not because I couldn't. The title had always been in my name, despite Todd's attempts. But because it no longer felt like mine. Too many shadows. Too many things that smelled like past versions of me. The tea mug he'd once dropped and said, You're getting clumsy. The living room, I wasn't allowed to redecorate because it would mess with the resale value. I needed somewhere untouched. So I checked into a modest, extended-stay hotel near Santa Rosa. Nothing fancy, a kitchenette, a balcony, and most importantly, quiet. For the first week, I didn't do anything extravagant. No shopping spree, no lawyer visits, no news headlines, just slow mornings with coffee and books, long walks by the lake, reintroducing myself to the person I'd forgotten in all those years of being someone's everything. It was peaceful, and it was mine. The lottery check came in a thick envelope, delivered by private courier, $14.6 million minus taxes, deposited into a brand new account under a trust name. I stared at the zeros for a long time, not in shock, but with a strange kind of grief, because I knew I couldn't tell anyone. Not yet. Not even Doris. Not until I knew I was strong enough to hold on to this freedom without apologizing for it. It wasn't long before the consequences reached Todd. Daniel called one afternoon and said, "The judge has moved to permanently revoke the POA. There's also a fraud investigation pending." I asked if I needed to testify. He said no. We submitted everything we had. The paper trail alone was enough. I thought I'd feel triumphant. Instead, I just felt still. There was no joy in watching your child face consequences. Only clarity. Todd had chosen power over love, and now he'd live with that choice. 3 weeks later, I stood across from him again, not in court, not at Hollow Pines, but outside the county building, completely by coincidence. He looked older, tired. I didn't avoid him. He saw me, froze, then walked over like someone still unsure which version of me he was facing. "You look good," he said, awkward. "I am," I replied. He waited, like he expected me to fill the silence, to ask how he was doing, to reach back like I always had. But I didn't. I wasn't there to fix it anymore. "You really did it," he muttered, almost to himself. "You got out." "No," I said gently. "You locked me in. I freed myself." He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. For once, Todd Feldman, the man with all the answers, all the explanations, had nothing to say, and that was enough for me. I walked away, not with pride, but with peace. Weeks passed. I started volunteering at a small literacy center on the outskirts of town. One afternoon, a teenage girl asked if I was, retired or something. I laughed and said, "No, I'm just finally getting started." At night, I wrote, not about revenge, about becoming, about how a life can feel erased, but still burn under the surface, waiting for the right moment to rise, about how dignity, once taken, doesn't vanish, it waits. One crisp evening, I hosted a private dinner at a lakeside inn, just 6 women, all over 60, all with stories that started with giving too much and ended with finally choosing themselves. I didn't talk about the money. I didn't talk about Todd. I just shared what mattered, that being forgotten isn't the end. It's just the silence before your voice returns. Before bed that night, I stood on the balcony and looked up at the sky. No more institutions, no more labels, no more needing to be believed to be free. Just me, whole, quiet, unshakable. If you've ever been made to feel like your love was a burden, if you've ever been erased from your own story by someone you raised, someone you trusted, I want you to comment below with just 2 words. I remain. Because that's the quiet revenge. Not the courtroom, not the money, just surviving. Fully, fiercely so, without needing their permission anymore. This was my revenge story. But maybe it's yours too.